I am representing an organization called the International Humanistic Management Association, amongst which also your host John Boulong and Benito Tejanque are members. And what I'm going to share with you for this conference are just some basic thoughts on what we need to do in terms of organizing to address some of the challenges that we're all facing right now, most specifically in the current crisis, health-oriented crisis, but also with regard to the environmental crises, etc. So we are not running out of crises, right? We have many different domains that are a challenge for humanity at large. It's environmental, it's pollution-oriented, it's poverty-related, hunger-related, corruption-related, mistrust-related. We have a number of inequality-related issues that really feed into political mistrust. And we have technological challenges like AI and others sort of exacerbate some of the challenges. We need to ask the question, why is it that we have what Kirk Hansen was talking about, so much mistrust, so much unethical behavior? Are these organizations that we have set up right now, are they fit for us? Are they fit for humans? Are they able to help us address the issues that we're all facing or not? And I'm not sure that you know these cartoon strips, Dilbert or maybe The Office as a series, but those are cultural phenomena that have been sort of present in the Western world, at least, to depict how business organizations specifically are not necessarily fit for us as human beings, but stifling even the human spirit in many different ways. Albert Einstein gets credit for many things, and he apparently also said that problems cannot be solved with the same mindset that created them. And what we're facing here, I would argue, even the issues that Professor Hansen was talking about, are ultimately questions that relate back to the intellectual paradigm that frames the way we see the world at large. And how we educate at business schools specifically does play a role, I would argue. And what we do typically in business schools, and that's where all the ethical issues also sort of come from, I would argue, is that we educate for a certain model that I call an economistic model. And to make that a little bit more visible visually, I put a triangular sandwich here on the left side in that, on this slide, which is an orientation towards maximization. Responsibility for a CEO is the maximization of shareholder value, of market share, of profitability, et cetera, et cetera. And that's set up, potentially supported legally in other ways, as something that is a good thing, that makes sense, that advances the common good. It is all related in some economic theory that ties this idea back, that if you individually maximize, if an organization maximizes, and if a society maximizes GDP, then we are all better off. Now, this is currently or getting more and more disputed. And what we're suggesting is another model that reframes responsibility is necessary. And I have a bagel here, and I don't know how many of you know of bagels or donuts, but think of it as a round food or round bread with a hole in the middle. And the bagel itself represents a zone of responsible management. It's a safe and just operating zone. It recognizes the outer boundary that there is a planetary limit, that there are planetary boundaries. You cannot grow infinitely on a finite planet. This seems so trivial, but it is challenging for the overarching paradigm. And then there are minimum thresholds, and that we call them dignity thresholds. Everybody needs to have enough to not only survive, but ideally like be seen as human being, to feel themselves as a human being. And we can go conceptually into what those are. They're typically qualified as social minima. But that makes responsibility in management and in society a different type of responsibility. It means that you move as a responsible manager people above the dignity threshold, and you move all the impacts of organizations and people overall into the safe and just operating zone, so you don't violate the planetary boundaries. So responsibility is not maximization, it is staying or getting into the safe and just operating zone. That is one challenge of the paradigm. Another challenge of the paradigm that we currently are witnessing is the underlying, what we call ontological story. Who are we as human beings? What do we assume about us as human beings? What is human nature in either of those models? The dominant model ultimately comes back to an idea of homo economicus that maximizes individual wants, potentially needs, but that maximizes income. You see Scrooge McDuck here. I'm typically asking in international audiences if you have a version of that character, and typically you do. It's a global character, it's a global phenomenon. We do have a version of that person that is oftentimes a cartoonish character that just wants more and is never satisfied. And so that is the assumption that underlies the economistic model that currently dominates our economic affairs. Now, most of us know that that is not quite true, that that is a model for a market behavior, and that we are a bit more complex. We are Homo sapiens, and we have survived for certain reasons that go beyond maximization of individual egotistical needs. But the economistic narrative has been so strong, and what we heard about from Kirk Hansen and others is an outcome. We have a certain type of person that is attracted by organizations that organize for maximization, and that oftentimes then get into legal trouble. And they could be called psychopaths, they could be called sociopaths, they could be people without morals, etc., etc. And psychologists could say they could study them not only in prison, they could study them at the stock exchange or in many corporations in higher level positions of power. The economistic narrative has a strong scientific background. And 200 years here worth of economics and finance indicate that social welfare is maximized when all firms in an economy attempt to maximize their own total firm value. And so you have this legitimacy for the economistic narrative that profit maximization, command and control, top-down governance, and all of the kind of things that we see in typical corporate endeavors is actually a good thing. Now we know, and maybe you have heard of this movie, for example, Corporation as a Person, that they are psychopathic. They're seeing responsibility as a cost, and it only sort of matters if it is imposed. Its responsibility is imposed through legal frameworks, etc. Or from an enlightened perspective, if responsible behavior does help you make more profit. There is a whole literature on the business case for responsibility and business ethics. And I would argue that many of those things are not going to help us address the big issues that we're facing. We need a new story. That is my argument. Here I'm putting up a picture of people in Ukraine protesting for freedom in the cold, cold winter. And they wouldn't do that if they were only interested in their own survival or in their own well-being, because it's very cold. They're getting beaten up and they stand for something bigger. So we can see this in many places, that we're not only interested in our personal advances, we're interested in our social advances, family, tribes, etc. We can see that, but we don't include that really in our story. So here is the challenge that we as Humanistic Management Association are throwing out to the world. We are providing a different model of human nature that builds on what we call the consilience of knowledge of the natural sciences, the humanities, and the social sciences. And in a very simplistic way now, we're using a 4-drive model that is based on evolution, that allows us to understand how and why human beings have survived. We have a drive to acquire things that we need to survive, obviously. And we also are able to defend those. That's the drive to acquire and the drive to defend, DADD. Those we share with pretty much any other living sentient being, because otherwise we would not have survived, obviously. Now, in terms of our evolution, Homo erectus was our predecessor, and Homo habilis was a predecessor of Homo erectus. Homo habilis was apparently the type of person that only was driven by the drive to acquire and the drive to defend. We could say an Homo economicus, but they died out. And Homo erectus, as our predecessor, was able to survive because they had one clear advantage, which was that they became social. They were not individualistic, they were tribal. They could share and collaborate. They could create families that would work together, that would help with child rearing, with food provision, with collaboration in all kinds of domains. And in that episode as Homo erectus, we actually developed a much larger brain and a much shorter intestine, because we also were able to learn how to cook and derive the benefits from a community around the hearth, so to speak. Of course, Homo erectus is not who we are. We were, as Homo erectus, would not have survived because we didn't have the adaptability that Homo sapiens has. Homo sapiens developed even more cranial power, which allowed us to develop a prefrontal cortex, which made us sapiens. Sapiens meaning knowing, smart, abstracting. We can solve problems by thinking about them. We can develop tools, sophisticated tools like the computers that allow us to bring us together. That is a power that Homo sapiens has developed. So far, it allowed him and us to survive. We have in the brain apparently a new way that allows us to make sense of the world. And Paul Lawrence, whose work this is based on, suggests that this is an independent drive that we need to always address to be sort of functioning in this current world. It's the drive to comprehend. We want to make sense of things. We want to understand the world. We know that Homo sapiens across the globe, whenever he as a species emerged, she as a species emerged, founded some kind of a narrative to explain an origin story, a religious story, some way of explaining where we're coming from, where we're going, and who we are. And that's considered to be sort of something central. We need to have a purpose in life that goes beyond the acquisition of stuff, beyond the defense of stuff. And it is also going beyond our drive to bond that made us a social human being. So the argument that we're making here is that if we want to have organizations that support us as human beings, then we need to have a better understanding of how we work as human beings and what we need to have in place to be functioning and thriving. And we suggest it is a balance of these four drives. We need to acquire what we need to live. We need to be able to feel psychologically safe and physically safe. We need to feel trusted and trusting in a type of community. The drive to bond is very important. And also we need to have a purpose that's higher than just the acquisition of material wealth. In that sense, evolutionary science matches onto what Aristotle and philosophy and theology always knew to some degree, that we are social animals endowed with reason. Social is the drive to bond, animal represents the drive to acquire and drive to defend, and endowed with reason means the drive to comprehend. Darwin, for many, this might be a surprise, actually mentions exactly that. He says that morality, meaning a balancing of those four drives for ourselves and others, is a key to survival. And when you talk about Darwin in a typical sense, in a social sense, most people will say it's the survival of the toughest, roughest, and meanest. But Darwin actually says, no, it's the social, it's the moral, the ethical type of people that are able to build trust with each other in the tribe that have a higher likelihood to survive. It's not only the individual level selection mechanism, but the group level selection mechanism that allows us to understand why teams, why organizations, why societies survive better than others. And we would argue that we're currently threatened in our survival because our morality, our ethical principles aren't really all that intact and don't allow us necessarily to survive. A theologian, Hans Küng, has identified exactly the same kind of aspect on human nature and suggests that religions across the globe, ethical narratives, share two domains, and the domain is dignity, that we intrinsically as humans have intrinsic value, but that life overall has intrinsic value. And what does that mean? It means that we have, according to Kant, everything has either a price or a dignity. Whatever has a price can be replaced by something else as its equivalent. On the other hand, whatever is above all price and therefore admits no equivalent has a dignity. That is a fundamental challenge to the market logic, according to which everything has a price, and according to which we have to justify ethical behavior also only through it pays, the business case logic. We argue that ethics is something that we would value intrinsically. We appreciate good behavior that honors our dignity and the dignity of others. It is not often present, but when it is, we flock to it. It is something that is fitter for survival. Now, the economistic perspective denies the concept of dignity. It says like Michael Jensen here said, we all have a price. Like it or not, individuals are willing to sacrifice a little of almost anything we care to name, even reputation or morality, for a sufficiently large quantity of other desired things. And these things do not have to be money or even material goods. So Henry Mintzberg paraphrases this statement as, we are all whores. Now, dignity is a concept, but it's also something that resonates with us deeply. This is an image of Kant 2.0, one of the longest running ad campaigns, I think for more than 20 years. You've probably come across some version of that, where people resonate very clearly with a statement that says there are some things that money can't buy, and those are really valuable for us, like family, like a good environment, like being together in peace. But for everything else, there is MasterCard. So I'm giving a shout out to the company here. I shouldn't necessarily do that, but I'm doing that in the sense that these groups wouldn't be paying for these kind of advertising campaigns if it wouldn't deeply resonate with people across the globe. So this dignity principle, we suggest, is a cornerstone of a reframed way of how we organize or could organize in a new normal. And basically that is the cornerstones. Those are the cornerstones of what we call humanistic management. Dignity and its protection, and then also dignity and its promotion, which ultimately boils down to a well-being or a flourishing promotion. With this notion of dignity, we conceptually alter the objective function. Economists call the objective function typically the predictive way of establishing what we want to achieve, and therefore that's how we then maximize. But here the maximization, if you wanted to maximize, has two constraints. One is the dignity protection, and then well-being is a measure of, is the alternative objective function that we want to maximize or balance or aspire to. I'm just showing here a number of ways how you can see that. The economistic model can be sophisticatedly adapted with these insights, in that the drive to bond, the drive to comprehend, and the drive to defend are all sort of addressed in a way, but also and almost always to maximize the drive to acquire. So you have compliance-oriented ethics programs that will tell you that this is sort of something that we need to do to be in business, to stay in business. We will create corporate social responsibility programs, but only because that pays, or because if we didn't have them, we wouldn't be allowed to stay in a certain community or get into a community. Or we would create certain safety protocols, like Professor Kirk Hansen was saying, in terms of BP, if we need to maximize profit. If we don't, then we drive them down. This is what the economistic logic does, and this is what I argue is what we're trapped in at large, and that requires a shift. And the humanistic model basically says we need to respect the dignity threshold, which is a balance of the four drives, and then go beyond that balance and manage towards well-being. Again, just to remind you, that's the kind of shift that we're talking about, from the triangular maximization model to a circular balancing model. This is not necessarily new, it's just a different perspective on formalization of the theoretical and conceptual pieces. There are a number of companies, and B Corps and others were mentioned before, that are actually practicing that. We don't necessarily read about those companies if we study business. We focus in business schools, unfortunately, mostly on corporate models that represent less than 1% of the business community. And we therefore get a very skewed perspective of what business is. But in this context, I'll just sort of leave you with these thoughts. There are different ways that our creative mind as a species can enable, or can think, or can enact how we run organizations, how we manage them, how we organize them. And the humanistic types, they exist. And what we hope the new normal will be, that more and more will show up because they're just fitter for survival of our species. So if we want to do research, practice, and educate, or advise on policy for better management, we just need to arguably be aware of the paradigmatic prison that we're in, that we try to find solutions within a paradigm that really doesn't allow for these solutions. It just lets us imagine less bad. And with that, I want to stop, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Michael. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Wow, that was great. Michael, as I was listening to you, I remember how we first met in the Academy of Management, and it was always my dream to get you to the Philippines. So we were still working on that as a back project. But one of the silver linings of the pandemic is we got you here online. So this is really great to see you here with us.
Yes. And I would love to come in real.
We'll make that happen, my friend.
Yes.
Meanwhile, we were able to fix the video issue, and I believe it's really so important that the audience sees your video, because it clarifies and also builds on the message you just shared with us. So I'm going to ask Ian to show this 3-minute video while our audience prepares their questions and puts them online. Ian, could you show that video for us, please?
We are living in tumultuous times, with an array of global crises challenging the way we think and do business. Einstein famously stated, "We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them." Still, the practitioners of mainstream business, as well as their teachers, seem to lack such an alternative way of thinking. As William Allen, the former Chancellor of the Delaware Court of Chancery, notes, one of the marks of a truly dominant intellectual paradigm is the difficulty people have in even imagining an alternative view. At the Humanistic Management Network, our work on conceptualizing this much-needed alternative humanistic paradigm starts by laying out the dominant narrative of the current economistic paradigm. We argue that our understanding of who we are as people fundamentally influences the way we organize individually, in groups, in organizations, and in society. We present these two narratives in business: the economistic paradigm, the dominant model, represented by Homo economicus, that accurately represents about 1% of the population, and the alternative model, the humanistic paradigm, represented by the 99% of the population. While more scientific evidence supports the latter perspective on human beings, economics and management have mimetically adopted an understanding based on assumptions supporting the former. The understanding of human beings as uncaring and narrowly self-interested has influenced the way business structures are set up, limited liability, and focus on profit maximization. The humanistic perspective allows us to understand the importance of care, the notion of human dignity, and the evolutionary reasons why humans only survived when organizing for the common good. This more scientifically supported perspective allows us to envision organizations as caring communities that converge to produce wider benefits. The Humanistic Management Network has chronicled numerous organizations that follow the humanistic paradigm. The fact that many organizations are run successfully and oftentimes better proves that alternatives to the current economistic understanding of organizing exist. Reality proves possibility and can thus inform theory. We argue that a focus on human dignity, understood as that which escapes all price mechanism and is valued intrinsically, can improve theoretical accuracy of current paradigms. If we set out to organize in ways that include the common good, we may be able to understand how business can contribute better to solving current global problems. To learn more, visit www.humannetwork.org.
Great. So I'm sure our participants would love to see how they can access that. So I'm gonna post that in the chat right now so you can use it for your teaching and research purposes. So as we prepare for the open forum, Michael, I think it was really important that you went down into the deepest level of this issue, which is that the way we teach about human nature is deeply defective. And unless that is addressed, everything else will be a surface solution. And this, I think, speaks to the very importance of education, because education's role is really to develop that deep understanding of reality and that part of reality that is human nature. So I'd like to open therefore the open forum with a question I can see from Carlos Saavedra in the Q&A. Carlos says, in our existence in this universe, human beings are not even a speck of dust. However, we were still given an opportunity to evolve beyond our limitations. What is human is not an established state. The state of other creatures has been established. They just have to eat and they would have fulfilled their full potential. We were given the freedom to become whoever we want to become, but our social structures have limited this capability. I would like to ask this question. Michael, he poses this to you. Do you believe that the concept of inclusive consciousness is how the shift should go to?
So I love the question, and it very shows a deep appreciation of the topic, Carlos Saavedra. Thank you very much. And I'm not quite clear what inclusive consciousness, what you mean by inclusive consciousness, but certainly if it's sort of something like non-local consciousness that we can all tap into, that we have access to, that other people could call God or have called God, or something larger, bigger than themselves, that is a global cosmic intelligence that helps us sort of guide certain principles. I think that's sort of where we're coming to if we want to understand where we're going as a species, and how we're going to get there through a certain alignment, through a certain awareness, a shift in awareness, and more open consciousness in a way of how we see ourselves as part of the universe, an evolutionary story, and as part of society that also evolves, cultural evolution that is occurring every day in sometimes destructive ways, as we are witnessing in the past, or have been witnessing in the past, but also in a much in a potentiality that we haven't really tapped into that could be very positive and constructive. And we have all kinds of possibilities. We're not limited in that sense. And that's where the thinking, the awareness, the consciousness, the perspectives we take, the paradigms we use to see things, uncover things, and use intention, and intentionality matters to get and create. And I think this is the sacred role of educators. This is what we can authentically contribute. And I'm afraid to say that many business school professors specifically are seen as tools for the maximization machine. And what you need to do is sort of come in and provide people skills so they can go out and do that. But this is a challenge that I want to put out there. And I think we have been working on this also with Oscar Bolong and others. It's like, there is a sacredness in this job, in the possibility of educating yourself, that we're not fully giving credit to.
Thank you, Michael. I love the way you always emphasize the sapiens aspect of being humans. And indeed, our role as educators is always to remind our students that we are thinking, creating, seeing beyond possibilities kinds of creatures, and not just consumption machines during Black Friday. This is a question this time from Bea de Ocampo, and she asks, how do we measure well-being? Is there a model on this already? How would corporations know if they meet it already or not? Or is this just completely subjective? Your take, Michael?
So there are many ways that people have assessed well-being in the meantime, right? When we started with that work, it was truly seen as more of a subjective way. Now, the 4-drive model that we proposed blends itself to assessing also objectively. And if you look at what the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are, or if you look at the OECD well-being, better life indices, they're all having a measure of objective factors and of subjective factors that do matter at the level of the individual, but also within the organization. And a B Corp assessment is an assessment in terms of well-being, ultimately, okay? And so is, in many ways, other types of shifts in the accounting domain around environmental, social, and governance principles, yeah? So all of these things are happening, maybe not with the term flourishing and with the term or the notion of what we call humanistic management. They oftentimes actually are hampered by the economistic frame, because they're still focusing on sort of having environmental and social domains secondary to profitability concerns. And that's, I think, where this comes in. There's a lot of movement in that space. And that's where also the invitation goes out to everybody here interested in this. This is where the work is. The intellectual work, but also the work in practice, and how do you put this in place? And there is a lot of stuff happening right now.
Thank you, Michael. Indeed, there are many parallel developments that support the well-being paradigm that you just explained, especially the Sustainable Development Goals. We now have a question from Jess Ranieses, which I think is very close to your heart, Michael. You've written on this. How does humanistic management tie in with the concept of social entrepreneurship? Will there still be a need for the concept of social entrepreneurship if we ever reach a world where all businesses think of promoting human dignity?
And yes, these concepts are, I would say that social entrepreneurship social innovation, all of those are manifestations of what we call humanistic management. And these, you can swap out those terms, but they're part of a different paradigm. So yes, they're closely aligned, but you have practices of conscious capitalism, of inclusive capitalism, you have practices of community-based businesses, social businesses, and all of those that are not necessarily social entrepreneurship or qualified as such, but they will also fit into the humanistic management paradigm. And what I want to mention is that humanistic management is a term which uses capital M management as a way to identify organizing practices that transcend business. They could be applied in government, in universities, in churches, in all kinds of organizations, including in the family. And so this is what we're looking at in terms of management. But yes, of course, it is part of the business world as well.
Thank you, Michael. I shared your paper of 2009 on social entrepreneurship as the vehicle for humanistic entrepreneurship. Let's go to the next question. This time we have a question from, I believe this is Rowie. How can the customers put pressure on corporations to prioritize the dignity as well as the well-being of its stakeholders?
I think this is already happening. And you can see that, of course, everybody that is concerned about corporate behavior and misconduct, like we seem to be here in that space, can make decisions around where they buy and who they work for and who they support, who they invest in. Those are the basic decisions, who they write about, who they want to learn from in the university context. Like, what cases do we have? As I said, in universities, typically in MBA programs, for example, we focus on a very small subset of businesses. And most businesses aren't corporate structures. They're not necessarily all the kind of American-based organizational types, and still we give them a lot of credit. So we can talk and think about all kinds of other organizations. And in that sense, we should look at cooperatives as social enterprises, as indigenous organizations from the Philippines. How do they work, where, and how do they protect dignity and promote well-being, and potentially are therefore seen as illegitimate, maybe underdeveloped. There is a very much of a colonial mindset behind that sort of says this is what business and modern business and real and true business is. And oftentimes it means it's a formulaic type of top-down governance and command and control thinking in terms of managing resources. If you hear the term resources, human resources specifically, you know that you're in the economistic paradigm. And so, yeah, I think we can all do our part in that sense as customers, consumers, students, professors, investors, employees.
Thank you, Michael. So you're bringing to the table the idea that we should even critically examine what we mean by development. And so that is also a related, shall we say, misconception that needs to be probably re-examined. And that ties to the question of Dr. Ramon Habaradas now in the Q&A. The assumption of humans as economic beings has led to the growth of businesses and to economic growth that has lifted millions from poverty over the last century. Don't you think this was a necessary phase for us to go through? Now, that particular assumption is being questioned and is leading us towards considering a fresh assumption about the nature of man. Are you confident that this new assumption will take hold?
I would say it has to take hold, otherwise we're done. And we see the boundaries and the limitations of that model. And I'm not necessarily saying that it was a bad thing in 200 years ago when this emerged and when this then became codified. It was clear that many of the limitations in our dignity also were related to the drive to acquire. We didn't have enough to even just survive from that basic perspective. And yes, there is a lot of progress that is laudable that we have been able to make as a species in terms of alleviating poverty. And yes, maybe this is not the main concern, it's still a concern. And the question is how we do it, and how we would use our ingenuity not to just exploit and rob the natural resources and dump them in a take, make, and waste model, but how do we regenerate? How do we allow next generations to survive and thrive as well? How do we allow us to not create toxic waste anywhere we go? We're the only creature on nature, in nature, that really devalues nature and makes it less livable. And so that's a fundamental design problem, an intelligence problem, or misguided use of intelligence problem. And I'm not saying that there are benefits of the economistic model. I'm just thinking we can do better, and we must do better.
Okay, that's great. Well, we know that this is also a research conference, so I thought I'd end with this question, Michael. Research paradigms that are positivist and atomistic see human nature as passive and without capacity to decide. I'm referring to a lot of the research that uses highly sophisticated statistics to try to identify what makes humans tick. And from there, they decide that this is what humans are doing. How can we expand the research enterprise so that it incorporates judgment and decision-making for higher intentions, as you have explained?
That's an excellent question. And the question is then, what is research? And we have, again, a very dogmatic perspective on research, in a sense that it is now seen as basically empiricism. And it is a quantifiable way of doing statistics on a question that basically has been broken down to levels, atomistic levels of inquiry. And that means research, quote unquote, positivist research, atomistic research, as you say, is focused on what can we measure with the tools that we have. And we have made advances in the tools, and there continue to be advances in those tools. But the questions that we can answer with those tools is very limited. So we're still relying back on imagination, moral imagination, creativity, in a way of understanding, and maybe even making wild speculative conjecture a part of our research and knowledge creation domain. This is, I think, what's been missing in the university. And I'm originally from Germany. The term university and science there translates into creating knowledge. Wissenschaft, I don't know who might know about German, but John does. And so if you take knowledge creation seriously and don't use the typical Anglo-Saxon way of science as empiricism, then you have a lot of ways of creating knowledge. That includes a broader range that allows us to have judgment, decision-making for higher intentions included, but also just doesn't break it down to only, let's say, what is measurable in terms of the material outcome. And so I think most of us intuit that that is not sufficient. The question is, where do we go? Do we bring universities, organizations overall to bear and say, well, we declare an outcome that we value as XYZ, and this is how we're going to assess it newly and differently. And we can feel that we're alive, that we're thriving, that we're doing better, and that we're meaningfully engaged in the kind of work that we're doing. Most people cannot say affirmatively that that's what they're doing. That's the tragedy of the current situation, that most of us aren't feeling deeply connected with what they're doing. Most of us potentially do it for a paycheck, and that's definitely better than not having a paycheck, but it's certainly not covering the range of human potential in a way that we could have or could be doing. And that's sort of the provocation that maybe even a COVID situation allows us to think more deeply about. It's like, how do we want to live? Is this the kind of life you want to live? Just going through the motions and doing meaningful automatic stuff rather than answering and inquiring on the more meaningful questions that we all have, the existential questions, etc., etc.
Thank you, Michael. So I think it's refreshing for our business teachers to be reminded that as business educators, they can also lead their students and their research readers on reflections about deeper purpose, the meaning of what we're doing, and so on and so forth. Normally, these are things we don't learn in a business class. I think we have one last question in the queue from your German-trained friend, Dr. Bulaum. So we'll end with his question, and then we can send the other questions to Michael after the session, and I'm sure he will be more than happy to respond. So John asks this question. Michael, thank you for a wonderful presentation. It is imaginative and insightful about our nature. It is interesting that you associate Homo economicus with some kind of psychopathology. In your experience, is it worthwhile to devote time and effort for what he calls therapeutic interventions for the psychopaths? Do you still engage that debate, given that it is difficult to reason with irrationality?
Well, the question, I mean, there's a lot of in there. Juicy question. Thank you. The question of reason and irrationality and all of that is a separate conversation, what those terms actually mean. And maybe the psychopaths are the truly rational beings in a sense that we set them up to be. But that's certainly not the life-conducive way of being human and alive in a way that we would see probably as educators as something that's what we want to promote. The therapeutic interventions, there are certain hardcore psychopaths from the literature. Their brain functions differently. No therapy will help there, according to that understanding. They actually should be treated separately. That's why they oftentimes end up in prison. That's why they're somehow potentially in other places. Historically, they haven't done well for society. And they have been able, some of the very intelligent ones have been able to reign society, be on the top of society. So we have seen from the studies that up to, in general populations, there are 1% of psychopaths. In organizational leadership, 6 to 10%. So 600 to 1,000% overrepresentation of psychopathic individuals in the positions of power. And so you can go back in history and study psychopathic leaders, Hitler, Napoleon, Stalin, those kind of people. They're the ones you can't do anything therapeutically, apparently. You need to get them out. You need to prevent them from even getting there. We have in the US a guy that is exactly that. I'm not sure what I can say about your country, but there are plenty of examples that oftentimes sort of tap very smartly into the drive to bond, the drive to comprehend, and present something very tribal that is reminiscent of a four-drive model, but they abuse it. And they abuse typically for the detriment of society overall. So with those people, it is not an intervention, it is a prevention, not having them in there, getting them out. With others that are sort of culturally psychopathic, which I would argue all of our business students become, we have good evidence of that, they're becoming psychopathized. We as educators do that, we can undo that. And that's where an intervention is necessary. Better education, we call it humanistic education, is necessary to prevent that. But you can also see that many of the coaching businesses and leadership trainings, all of them are these kind of therapeutic interventions that allow you, and as a sort of truly human person, to become a better version of yourself, and sort of get rid of the kind of psychopathic dimension of success, meaning having more stuff, dominating, being on top. And ultimately, most people suffer from that as a definition of success. So yes, there are those interventions, but they're not working for psychopaths, true psychopaths.
Okay, wow, Michael. So you framed that quite starkly, that the research is clear that there is evidence of psychopathology in high-level business, and that it is our role as educators to counter this pathology in the way we educate, and that is our essential intervention. So I'd like to thank you, Michael, and we close the open forum now so that we can close this wonderful session where you've brought us into really deep thinking about how to move our paradigms. So I give the floor back to Anne for our closing ceremonies for Michael's portion of the program. Anne?
Dr. Ben. On behalf of the organizing committee of the 8th National Business and Management Conference, I would like to express our appreciation by presenting this digital certificate. So this certificate of appreciation is awarded to Dr. Michael Pirson for delivering the keynote address titled Business Ethics in the Next Normal during the 8th National Business and Management Conference held last November 27 to 28, 2020 via Zoom video conferencing. The theme of the conference is Reimagining the Next Normal, Business and Management in the Philippines During Times of Uncertainty. Signed, Dr. Emilina Sarial, Dr. Antonio Lopez, and Dr. Oscar Bolaong Jr. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Pirson, for being with us today.
Thank you. Great honor. A great conference.